Hi, everyone. Today's topic is an introduction to probability and understanding probability, not just kind of having a vague general idea of what it is, but really understanding it is incredibly important to understanding how inferential statistical tests work. So if you've heard of a thing called a p-value, it's a probability. So we really need to understand what probability means. It's also something that our brains aren't that great at understanding. So we have to do a little bit of work. I have a fun activity for you to do later that's going to help you understand. All right, so we're going to get started with talking about historically how humans have thought about probability. And it mirrors the same kind of transformation that has occurred in our thinking. That is, going from a place where we um, believe that the sacred is controlling the universe to looking for patterns that we can see and understand without um, without assuming that there is something beyond our knowing that is running the show. Still could be. We're just not going to assume that it is there. All right, so this lecture is going to cover historical precursors to our current understanding of how probability works. We're going to talk about sacred fortune telling, which has been happening throughout human history, and then look at the development of how games and gambling and the use of some kind of devices, like we think about dice and cards, like are pictured on this slide, but a variety of different types of objects have been used for these purposes throughout human history. And then how our understanding of how probability works was sort of rapidly figured out once scientists and mathematicians, again in the 16 to 1700s, sort of stopped and looked at it and thought, well, there are some patterns going on here. Can we understand these? Is it possible to know what these patterns are in an objective way? So in that section, I'm going to reinforce three incredibly important concepts. Induction, again, a mathematical definition of it for you. We're going to look at the idea of a statistical probability, which is what the kind that we're going to be using in this class. And then also quickly look at the idea of inverse probability, which is really more important in that it was first time that error is introduced into thinking about how can we know something. If we assume that there is error, it turns out that it makes it possible for us to know with much more certainty. All right, we'll talk about that a little more when we get there. All right, so throughout human history and up through today, of course, you can still go and get your tarot cards read. Um, People have been interested in knowing something about what maybe their fate is or what they should do with themselves or to try and communicate with sacred beings of some kind. And there's a wide variety of different ways that different cultures have have made that happen. And so I have some examples on this slide, starting with traditional methods of gazing into a glass ball, like this painting shows, or a teacup with tea leaves left in it. The person who has drank the tea is going to make a pattern by how those tea leaves stay in the cup, and it will be interpreted, right, by somebody. So this is not only a human endeavor, it's also a profession. So other cultures had different ways of sort of selecting or what we now call randomly choosing an object from a set of objects, and that those, whichever one you get, is intended to say something about your particular situation. So we have examples of runes in Europe, the Nordic countries, tarot cards, which is throughout Europe and spread around the world eventually. And this image depicts the patterns of the I Ching, ancient Chinese practice, where you drop a handful of sticks, and the pattern they fall into is going to tell you something about yourself. So these methods all are taking something that we now would consider kind of a random process. If we just draw chips, these rune chips out of a bag, we can't see which ones we're picking, that we're going to get each of those chips with a certain, frequency. But in the context of sacred fortune telling, you're actually interpreting, you're imagining that the gods or God is guiding your hand to pick out the particular chips that are relevant to your life and give you some guidance for what you should do. All right. So we again, like early or precursors to the scientific method, we have an association between something that's happening and with and the will of the gods shaping that event. All right, so another thing that has been true throughout human history is that people want to be entertained. They want to feel the excitement of betting and maybe winning some money. And so we find a wide variety of objects that have been used across multiple cultures globally to provide some kind of gaming um, situation. So we think of dice as being something that we might use for this kind of thing. And if we sort of go back through history, dice that are very carefully carved, like in this picture at the top, only go back to ancient Rome. Before that, they were very crudely carved. They didn't have the nice right angles on the edges. They didn't have the carefully made pips on them that would ensure that they would roll so that each side came up an equal number of times. All right. So if you went to a casino today, you don't get to bring your own dice. They have these very finely manufactured dice that are fair or that they roll so that each side comes up equally. So prior to the idea of dice, the most common instrument for randomization, at least in countries that had sheep and goats, are on the lower left here. You see these are actual knuckle bones from the wrists and hands of sheep and goats, and they're just the right size that they're comfortable to hold in a human hand. And they actually have four sides that they fall on, and they don't fall on them with equal probability. But they have been used for all kinds of games of gambling throughout the ancient world. And an example of that is carved. It's basically like a cribbage set, and there's little pins on this board. And so you roll the knuckle bones or tali, often also called astragali, and those would determine how you move your pins along this board. Right. Prior to knuckle bones, people and across the other cultures, people also used cowrie shells to toss. They have two sides, the flat side with a little indentation and the round side. They can come up either way. And also carved sticks that come up on possibly either two sides or four, depending on where and when you're looking. Right. But during these ancient time periods, people still believed that luck or fortune was going to be determining what sides came up, possibly if they prayed to a goddess, Tyche in ancient Greece, or Fortuna in ancient Rome. that those goddesses might put a fortunate result up on the table for them. Now, when we get to, again, the 1600s, and we find that there's actually a growing economic importance of gambling, and that as the scientific method is sort of developing and people are really starting to work hard, put their smart minds to problems in math and other um, phenomena in the natural world, we find that there were indeed scientists who had gambling problems. And so that some of these men were some of the first to start thinking about, wait a sec, I notice when I spend a lot of time rolling dice, for example, because I gamble a lot, that certain combinations are going to come up more often than others. And so they were trying to figure out, for the scientific part, but also because maybe they wanted to win some money because they were not wealthy. Needed it. So in this picture, we have examples of, sorry, Blaise Pascal on the right and Fermat on the left. So these early scientists, right, the way that they did their work was fairly isolated. They would sit around in their lonely garret or cheap room somewhere and think about problems. There may be a handful of other scientists around them if they lived in a big city, and they would get together with those people at meetings in what they called societies, and could talk about the ideas that they were having, argue with one another. Scientists have always loved to argue with one another. Or they could write letters to other scientists around the world and share ideas. Say, I'm working on this problem. I'm thinking this is a solution to it. What do you think? The other person would write back and say, no, 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 you're all wrong. This is how you do it. And so eventually, they would come to, or maybe not, come to a solution they both agreed on. And so it was really hard for scientists to share the work that they were doing on um, until until 1665, when the very first scientific journal started being published, and it was the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London. And so, really, that was the first time that work by scientists in one location was really being written down, and people could, subscribe to or purchase this journal so that they could learn what was going on in other geographic areas. The other way that scientists could make their work known is to publish books. Right. And so we do have the work of many of the scientists from this era in books that they wrote and published. So one of the books that was extremely influential on probability math is that it's called Essay on the Analysis of Games of Chance, and it was published by a marquis. So he was wealthy, he was influential, and him publishing this work really led to working out the mathematics for games of chance as being something that was really part of science. It wasn't just kind of a hobby of some disreputable lowlifes. So there were three key components of this mathematical theory of probability that we're going to talk about. The first one is induction, and then we'll look at statistical probability, and then after that. All right, induction, we already have a brief introduction to, and we're going to return to it over and over and over again in the semester. All right, and so this is Bernoulli, and he's famous for describing mathematically what we can know. from a sample taken out of a population. Right? So over and over again, we're going to be talking about this process of looking at a sample and inferring or drawing an inductive conclusion to what's true about a population. And his observations were based on sort of a simple situation, simplify things so that we can make them easy to figure out for the first time. Suppose you draw a chip from an urn, right? An urn is like a pottery vessel. We think of them as things you put your deceased loved one's ashes in, but it was, basically a jar with a lid. So you can't see what's inside of it. All right, so somebody else put some chips in there. You don't know what color they are. You don't know what kind of material they're made out of. You know nothing. Zero. You have zero information about what's inside that urn. All right, so you reach your hand in and you draw one chip out. All right, you draw one chip. It is the color orange. All right, the only thing that you can conclude from this ridiculously tiny sample of one chip is that all the other chips in the urn, if there are any, is that they're orange, right? So you've got one orange chip out of one chip that you drew or that you pulled out of the jar. And so 1 divided by 1 is 1, all right? If we multiply it by 100, it's 100%. So the only thing that we can conclude if we draw one orange chip is that all the chips are orange. Make sure you understand that. Okay, now I'm going to take a sample and I've put my first orange chip back, right? I'm going to draw, and I happen to draw 9 green chips and 1 orange chip, right? So I've drawn a total of 10 chips. I have my 10 chips laying here on the countertop beside me. One of them is orange out of the 10 that I drew. So 0.1 or 10%, we multiply it times 100, are orange, and 9 out of 10, 0.9 or 90% of my chips are green. Okay, so now I have a sample of 10, and what I can conclude from this sample about the entire population that's in the urn, the stuff that's left over plus the stuff I've already pulled out, right? The only thing I can conclude is that 10% of the chips in the urn are orange and 90% are green. Right? That's all I can know. All right, now, suppose I put those back and I draw out at random one at a time. And what I end up getting out of 20 chips is 5 orange, 14 green, and 1 blue. All right, now I want to make something clear. When I say draw 1 orange chip, so oops, there's a typo there, and 9 green ones, I don't mean that I drew 1 and then I drew 9 green, 1 orange, and then 9 green. So I drew a sample of 10 chips and I looked at what I had and I tallied it up. Okay, sorry if that wasn't clear. All right, so my last example, I decided to draw a total of 20 chips, one at a time. I lay them down and then I count them up. What did I get? I got 5 orange chips. I got 14 green ones and 1 blue one. All right, so based on this sample, I can conclude I got 5 out of 20 chips are orange. So 5 divided by 20 is 0.25. Multiplied by 100, it's 25%. 14 out of 20 is 0.7, or 70%. And 1 out of 20 is 0.05, or 5%. Okay, so when I drew one chip, I got something that didn't represent the whole population, right? That's a problem of induction that we talked about already. When I had a larger sample size, when I drew 10 chips, I discovered that there was more than one color of chip in the bin. right? But I couldn't conclude that until I had actually drawn one out, right? Same thing happens when I take even bigger sample. Um, I didn't even know that there were blue chips in there, right? Until I had enough sample size that I actually happened to grab one. All right, so this way of taking how many did you get in your sample and calculating the proportion and using that as a way to describe what I think is true about the population. This is a mathematical definition of induction, and this is basically how we're going to use it in statistical testing. Okay. Oh, what we know until we take every single chip out of our urn is what is actually true about the population. All right. So the larger our sample gets relative to the population, the better we know what's true about the population. But until we have sampled every single individual, every single chip, we just dump the urn upside down, take all the chips out of it, right? Then we can know what is true about the population, right? That's very important. We'll come back to it again when we talk about the mathematical. All right, so another really important concept, which was first written about by de Moivre, is that we use the word probability, we use the words chance, we use odds, we use the word likelihood. We kind of toss them around. We use them in different ways, really. Um, and if we have a bunch of words that we're using in this kind of vague and not quite exactly the same way all the time, then it's difficult to really define more pieces of information about it. So his important contribution was that there's a way that we use these words kind of in everyday life that means a degree of belief. It doesn't mean something mathematical, right? And so he called this the epistemological definition, right? Which is how we know things, right? So it's the it's sort of an emotional or subjective or personal way of expressing that there's some that you have some amount of knowledge, right? And I call this the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire definition of probability, because if you remember that show, you had an option where you could phone a friend if you didn't know the answer to a question and you could get help from that friend. Well, what are the people are always asking the friend, how sure are you that that's the right answer? Because if they answer the question wrong, they lose all the money that they've already accumulated. And so the friend would say, oh, only 50%. They weren't if they didn't know the thing their friend had called to ask them about. Right? I mean, I watched the show some. I didn't watch every single episode, but I don't think I ever heard somebody say 100%. Um, so this degree of belief in the correctness of their answer is what people were trying to convey or communicate in giving that percentage. All right, now that's different from the statistical definition, which is the tendency displayed by some chance devices to produce stable relative frequencies. All right, so this is a mathematical definition. It's also called objective, um, a way of measuring um, how frequently different outcomes occur when you're using some kind of device or process that has multiple possible outcomes, right? And we'll come back to this again when we're talking about the mathematical rules of all right, finally, inverse probability. And this was written about by Laplace. And it's really hard to explain how important this concept is. All right, so his idea was that we're trying to figure out what the actual true size of something is. All right, so it's easiest to imagine this as an object that has a particular size. Um, so we have this irregularly shaped object. This green blob is just something that we're trying to measure. Pretend it's a rock or something, if that helps you. And this black line is representing from one edge of it to the other. This is representing its actual true size, the real size of this thing. And what Laplace thought was, what if any measurement that we make of this object is actually imperfect, right? It doesn't quite get at the true size, and that there's going to be some difference. It might be tiny, it might be large, some difference between our measurement, which we're going to call capital P, and the true size S. All right, so these two number lines are trying to show that here we have S, which is the real true thing, and then we take some measurement. We attempt to measure this thing. Whatever we measure, we're going to call it P. Now, we don't know this, all right, but there's some difference between P, our measurement, and S, the truth about how large this thing is. So we're going to define this term, little e, error. And it's the difference between big P and S. All right, so we know what has to be true in this case is if we add capital P and little e together, that's equals. So if we have some way of estimating either P or little e, turns out is the important thing, that we can actually tell what S is. All right, so if we take a bunch of measurements with our measuring instrument, they're going to be a bunch of P plus E's. So there's going to be some variation between them. And so the variation between those measurements is going to be this error. And we'll see very soon that the mean of our measurements is going to be the best guess estimate, best estimate of the actual value of S. Right, so we got to include the possibility of error inside of our thinking, and then we can actually have a way to measure it. All right, if you're thinking to yourself, we're measuring a rock, how hard is it? I mean, really, you're going to get the right measurement of the thing. All right, it just seems obvious. So if you're thinking that, let's look at this example. So here's some tomato plants growing in this bin, and we have somebody who's holding near the top of one of the tomato plants. If you look closely, there's a little V here. This is the branch between, sorry, the V is a shape between the newest, youngest leaf and the next oldest leaf. And that's the point at which we are going to measure the height of the tomato plant. And there is a metric measuring stick being held up next to the plant here. And if you want to try and look right across at the measuring stick and at where the V is on the plant, then that's what we're trying to measure. All right, so you've got the measuring stick placed on the soil, and you're holding it up to next to the plant. You're trying to eyeball this measurement. All right, so suppose I had 10 different people walk up and measure this plant, and they kept their data to themselves. They didn't know what the other people had gotten in their measurements. All right. Well, it turns out I actually do this with students in the in-person version of the class, and people get different measurements. Right? You hold the measuring device a little differently. You push it down in the soil, or you let it rest on top of the soil a little higher. You're holding the plant. You're trying to hold it up straight. You're trying to hold the ruler up straight. Exactly where you estimate that V is. Do you measure it from the top of the V or the bottom of the V? All right, so these different measurement estimates actually happen in real life, right? And it's also when we're trying to measure things that are a little more complicated than, just the size of a rock we're holding in our hand. So again, what is the true height of this plant? You might contend that your measurement, the one that you measured, is the best one, and that's the true height. But it turns out that actually the best way to measure the true height of this plant is to take these multiple measurements and calculate the mean of them. And you probably knew that already, but there is something that's to do with this inverse probability, and that is actually turns out to be true. All right. So why do we need statistics? Because we want to know the height of the plant, right? But it's actually a much harder question to find the correct answer to than you might have imagined previously. All right, I want to quickly mention just one more mathematician who was studying probability at this time. And the reason I want to mention it is because I've talked about how important it is to look at different methods, not just the one I'm teaching you this semester. All right, so we're going to be using this falsification paradigm with a null hypothesis. So there's an alternative to testing hypotheses that way, and it's called Bayesian analysis, because this mathematician who was also a minister, Reverend Thomas Bayes, he did work on what are called conditional probability distributions. So if you don't know anything, like we did with our urn, we don't know anything about what's in it, and we take one chip, then we can say everything's 100% orange chips, right? But if we take another sample that's larger, we learn new things, right? So what do we think is true about the population inside the urn, given that we've taken this sample and we see that there are these proportions, right? So it seems pretty straightforward when we're working with the urn, but it turns out that in modern scientific study, Bayesian analysis is used for a wide variety of different kinds of analysis. And the basic idea of it is that you're going to test multiple competing hypotheses at the same time. And you're going to not try and falsify one, but you're going to measure sort of which one of them fits the distribution of outcomes, the probability distribution that you're seeing in your data. All right. That's all we're going to talk about for Bayesian analysis. But again, I just wanted to introduce it because if you go on into graduate school, into higher levels of statistics, or maybe a paper that you're reading, you might see reference to this Bayesian analysis. All right, I'll see you next time.